So the whole thing, from beginning to end, is a hoax. You are involved, by and large, in a very strange business system which divides your day into work and play. Work is something that everybody does, and you get paid to do it because nobody could care less about doing it. In other words, it is so abominable and boring that you can get paid for doing it. And the object of doing this is to make money. And the object of making money is to go home and enjoy the money that you've made. When you've got it, you see, you can buy pleasure. And this is a complete fallacy. Money never can buy pleasure, because all pleasures depend upon not putting down a symbol of power, money, but upon disciplines.
Now, there are many people who work in schools who believe that education, in fact, is the main point of what they're doing, and who are trying very hard to educate the people in their charge. However, the problem is that the whole system they're working in, the way it's set up and the way it is organised, is hostile to that golden endeavour, so that they're in the unfortunate position of constantly trying to push water uphill, if you will, and any success they have is gained against the odds. What we need to realise is that education and schooling are not the same thing. In fact, because we think that schooling is the same thing as education, we have a radically impoverished idea of what education is and could be. Why, for example, do we assume that education should only take place at one stage of a person's life? Education is something that can take place at any stage in someone's life, and indeed should do. Why assume that we have to educate people of the same age altogether? Surely this is a crazy way of doing it. Why do we have to deliver education in the highly structured and formalised way that schools require us to do it in? Education is something which will be central to most people's lives. What we need to do is to get away from the idea that schools are the only way in which we can deliver education.
We're seeing a society that not only has a lot more people of lower IQ, but a lot fewer people of higher IQ. In other words, a dumbing down, a chemical dumbing down of society. So everyone's sort of mediocre. That leaves them dependent on government because they can't excel. We have these people of lower IQ who are totally dependent. Then we have this mass of people who are going to believe anything they're told because they can't really think clearly. And very few people of very high IQ who have good cognitive function who can figure this all out. And that's what they want. So, you can kind of piece it together as to why they are so insistent in spending so many hundreds of millions of dollars of propaganda money to dumb down society.
We're getting used to a new way of being alone together. But you can end up hiding from each other even as we're all constantly connected to each other. One of the things that can happen is that we sacrifice conversation for mere connection.
I'm going to talk about materialism. So, what does this look like? Well, it looks like parents who now believe that the most important thing that they have to do for their children is buy them things. This is a particularly UK virulent phenomenon. Parents obsessed by brands for their children. No wonder we have the worst well-being of our children out of 20 OECD countries. We're talking about people with very little money who are going and spending £90 on a pair of leather baby booties because that's what they think they have to do to live without shame. It's about make-up parties for 3-year-old children. It's about, girls before they go to college in the morning spending 3 hours on their makeup because they are now so obsessed by their appearance. Now, where are these values coming from? Well, everywhere, and that's the scary part of this, not just the media. We're also getting them from politicians who now really act like business people in many ways by having focus groups, by courting the voters and saying, tell us what you want and we'll try and give it to you and your aspirational family, rather than having the notion of the good society and what can we do to make the country better or fairer. No, we now have consumer politics. I remember a couple of years ago, I was working with some factory workers and some office workers. And at one point I said to them, why do you think that there's been a big rise in depression? And of course they said, we've changed the definition and so on, and they're right about that. But just about everyone said a version of, because you're never good enough, you never have enough, and you never get there. And what I find is ordinary people understand this, but there is no leadership for it, very little leadership for it at the moment.
There's a reason for this. There's a reason education sucks, and it's the same reason that it will never, ever, ever be fixed. It's never going to get any better. Don't look for it. Be happy with what you got. Because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners now. The real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table and figure out how badly they're getting fucked by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. They don't want that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly shittier jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money. They want your fucking retirement money. They want it back, so they can give it to their criminal friends on Wall Street. And you know something? They'll get it. They'll get it all from you sooner or later, because they own this fucking place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club. And by the way, it's the same big club they use to beat you over the head with all day long when they tell you what to believe. All day long, beating you over the head in their media, telling you what to believe, what to think, and what to buy. The table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged. And nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care. Good, honest, hard-working people, white collar, blue collar, doesn't matter what color shirt you have on. Good, honest, hard-working people continue. These are people of modest means. Continue to elect these rich cocksuckers who don't give a fuck about them. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care about you at all. At all. At all. Yeah. You know? And nobody seems to notice, nobody seems to care. That's what the owners count on, the fact that Americans will probably remain willfully ignorant of the big red, white, and blue dick that's being jammed up their assholes every day. Because the owners of this country know the truth. It's called the American dream, because you have to be asleep to believe it.
When it comes to politics, many believe that if people just had more information, there'd be less debate. We'd all just know the facts and agree. But a new study shows that the more info people get, the better equipped they are to just argue for their own side. Having more information drove people further apart in the study. And then they found something even crazier, that the smarter a person is at math, the more likely they are to use information incorrectly to fit within their political ideology. In other words, the smarter a person is, the dumber they can be at politics. So more information doesn't mean we'll get the right answer, it just means we'll have more ammunition for being right, which sucks, because when you admit that you don't know anything, that's when you actually learn.
These are not good days for liberty. If you look around the world, you see that the idea of freedom which contains the sense of carefreeness, seems everywhere in retreat, hounded by guns and bombs. Cartoonists lie dead in Paris. And just yesterday, there was an echo of that terrible event in what one Danish citizen referred to as their fairy tale country, a place where they were not expecting such things. But there's, I think, another danger for those of us who wish to defend liberty. And that we can find here in America as well, which is the danger from a new kind of timidness, if you like. Even here, the classical values enshrined in the First Amendment are under attack by the rise of this new timid culture, which on the one hand, more and more accepts the arguments of thin-skinned bigots that offense must be a limiting point on freedom. I'm going to return to this theme because it seems to me that here in America, the danger to free expression is beginning to be greatest where it should be most defended. That's to say, within the walls of the academy. And the people most willing to sacrifice or limit this fundamental right are young people. Human nature is the same everywhere, in all times, in all places, in all languages, under all political systems. And all discussions of liberty and its limitations must flow from that fact. What is it that human nature demands and must be allowed? Not all of human nature can be considered good, which is why most of the Ten Commandments tell us what we should not do. Not kill, not lie, so on. But the best of human nature is our innate understanding of and need for personal liberty. Nobody anywhere ever enjoyed being a slave. Everybody, everywhere, offered a chance of freedom, grasps it as a thirsty man seizes a drink. And any of us, looking into himself or herself, can and will see the same driving forces. We are language creatures, and we want to be able to express ourselves in speech. We are autonomous individuals, and we want to express our autonomy. There is, yes, a counterforce in us also, in which we sometimes believe the group to be more valuable than the self, and maybe these two ideas, these two instincts in human beings are in conflict, but the need of the self to be itself and say what it is, say who it is very, very great. This is who we are. Free men and women, born free, as Rousseau said, but everywhere in chains. It's up to you to break those chains wherever you find them. It's in your hands. The future is yours. Don't screw it up.
His most recent work is entitled Pirates and Emperors. I asked him first about the title.
That's plagiarized from St. Augustine, who in the City of God has a story about Alexander. His forces capture a pirate, and there's an audience between the pirate and the emperor. And he asks the pirate, "How dare you molest the seas?" And the pirate asks him, tells him, "I'm a small man with a tiny boat, so they call me a pirate. You're an emperor with a vast navy, and you molest the world, but they call you an emperor." You know? And that's a good allegory for the world, and in particular the contemporary world. The pirates are the ones who are condemned, not the emperors. Of course, the general population is attacked by both the emperors and the pirates. So it's not that the pirate, St. Augustine is not saying that the pirate is a nice fellow. He's just saying he's a small criminal as compared with a major criminal.
So who does control the world? Who are the emperors?
Overwhelmingly the United States since the Second World War, Britain before that, and concentrations of private power, which are enormous, and a tyrannical corporation is closely linked to the powerful states. It's a network of concentrated power with international institutions like the IMF and so on, which are called, they sometimes call themselves the masters of the world. That's a phrase that was in the Financial Times, a little ironically, but not wrong. Actually, they call themselves the masters of the universe. Adam Smith called themselves the masters of the world. Now they're called the masters of the universe.
We've gone a bit beyond it.
Yeah, didn't have space age in Smith's time.
But don't you sometimes need big government to deal with big business, that in a sense there is a kind of balance between these large forces?
It's like saying there's a balance between two members of the board of directors of General Motors. Yes, there's some kind of a balance, but they're so closely interlinked and they're connected that they're, to first approximation, they're the same thing.
Now, did September the 11th, do you think, mark a change in world politics?
It's a historic event. It was the first time in hundreds of years that the West, Europe, and its offshoots have suffered the kind of criminal atrocity that they constantly carry out against others, which is quite a change. That's why there's such shock in the West. This kind of thing we do to you, you don't do it to us. I mean, it's like the reaction in England when, at the time of the so-called Indian Mutiny rebellion in India, tremendous shock that they should do to us what we do to them all the time. And my genius would use it as an opportunity to intensify repressive and sometimes violent actions, and that's just what's happened. So the Russians took it as an opportunity to step up their atrocities in Chechnya, assuming correctly that they would be authorized by Washington, at least tacitly. China did the same in Western China, Indonesia and Aceh, Israel and the occupied territories. And you run through the list. Countries ranging from the Central Asian dictatorships to democratic societies like the United States and others have used it as an opportunity to clamp down on their own citizens.
Now, looking at the current situation, when do you think is it right to intervene in the affairs of another nation?
I think there are conditions under which that would be possible. I mean, one basic condition is that nonviolent, you mean violent intervention, that nonviolent means have been exhausted. That's one condition. A second condition is that the people of the country in which you're intervening support the intervention. Under those conditions, and you can think of others, intervention would be justified. However, we don't ever apply those conditions. Take, say, South Africa under apartheid. There's no doubt that the overwhelming majority of the population would have favored intervention, probably military intervention. The other means had been tried for decades. Did anybody think of forceful intervention? Of course not, nor did I. Or take a recent case, East Timor. During 1999, there were very large-scale atrocities going on. The population undoubtedly would have been delighted in military intervention. Well, Britain and the United States did intervene, namely by supporting Indonesia. Did anybody think of moving to do something else? Of course not. In fact, Britain was sending jets to Indonesia even after the Australian-led peacekeeping forces entered. That's the way the great powers intervene.
Now, you make quite a lot in the book of the fact that there is freedom of expression in America. But what you do point to is something more insidious, because you suggest that there is actually, though there may be freedom of expression, there's a control of freedom of thought. Now, how does that happen?
It was understood back at the time of the First World War that it's becoming much more difficult to control people by force. The popular struggles have led to the development of unions, parliamentary labor party, franchise extended, and so on. And coercion is just not going to work by force. So therefore you have to control thought. It's very striking that the contemporary systems of thought control, which are highly developed, very self-conscious, so leaders talk all about it, they come from England and the United States. So the British Ministry of Information, which any reader of Orwell knows what it was, that's from the First World War. It was aimed primarily to convert a pacifist population into raving anti-German fanatics. And it worked. And it impressed people. It impressed the business world. That's the origins of the modern public relations industry. It impressed American intellectuals who developed the conception of what they called manufacture of consent, control of thought. Impressed Hitler, who blamed the German defeat on superior Anglo-American propaganda and vowed that next time Germany would be prepared. And it has led in England and the United States primarily, England secondarily, to huge industries devoted to control of thought and attitudes, because you cannot control people by force.
But dissent has been growing since the 1960s in the Western world. And people are far more sophisticated now. I mean, even popular culture reflects the fact that anything from the X-Files to the film The Insider, that the idea of people discussing things, of trying to manipulate public opinion, I mean, that's highly developed now.
Sure. But when people were under the lash, they knew about it too. People are so aware of it that it has led to tremendous cynicism about almost anything. I mean, nobody believes what government officials say. Nobody believes what they read in the press. People don't believe professions. It's led to enormous cynicism and tremendous opposition. In fact, in my view, the more crucial things than the ones you mentioned are opposition to aggression. I mean, just take a look at the current war in Iraq and compare it with, say, the Vietnam War. It's a comparison which is often made, the protest. But the comparison is completely false. The opposition to the war in Iraq is far greater than it ever was to the war in Vietnam at any remotely comparable stage. I mean, this is the first war in European history, Europe and the United States, first one I can think of, where there was massive protest before the war. It's never happened. I mean, in the case of the Vietnam War, there was no protest until years after the war began. I mean, just in the last 30 or 40 years, say the United States, the level of civilization among the general public, not intellectuals, a separate category, but among the general public, it's advanced enormously.
So do you think that intellectuals are not sufficiently engaged? Do you think they have become cynical?
Intellectuals are a separate category. Intellectuals are mostly servants of power. I'm talking about the general public, not the intellectual world. They remain pretty constant. I don't think they're subject to these changes, except marginally, of course, to some extent. But they're quite different. And quite generally, it goes right through history, intellectuals have been servants of power. Take, say, the First World War. On all sides, Germany, England, the United States, France, intellectuals were extremely enthusiastic about the war. There were a few dissenters, and the best known of them ended up in jail. Like Bertrand Russell, for example, or Eugene Debs in the United States, or Rosa Luxemburg in Germany. Very small group of critics, some of them best known imprisoned, but most intellectuals were enthusiasts for their own country, and that's common, and it remains common. I mean, intellectuals write history, so you have to be a little cautious about what they say about themselves. And it looks prettier when it's written in books.
So do you then think it's a failure of the left, then, in the United States, that if there is this feeling that a war is not right, that there isn't more action, more political action about it?
Depends what you mean by the left. I mean, the left, what I mean by the left is out in the meeting with the public all the time. It's out in the streets. And so there are meetings of thousands of people. The biggest university in the country, the University of Texas, came out with a strong anti-war declaration. That's never happened in the past. You go to working-class towns and thousands of people show up for demonstrations and meetings. That's what I'd call the left. It's not the articulate left, but then the articulate left is never permitted expression. So during the Vietnam War, you didn't hear them either. I mean, the New York Times, for example, would never permit a comment by someone on the left committed to the involved in the peace movement, maybe a sentence here and there. But that's standard.
As far as your attitude to government is concerned, I mean, you have been known for many decades as being an agitator against what you see as bad government. I mean, some people have wondered sometimes whether perhaps you could have, alongside the criticism, offered a little more in the way of solutions as well.
There's plenty of solutions. In fact, that's all I and other people offer is solutions. Often the solutions are don't carry out crimes. That's the simplest solution. So if you want to reduce terrorism in the world, let's say, there's one very simple solution: stop participating in it. That doesn't end everything, but it cuts back the amount of terror by quite a notable amount. So that's a simple solution. If you want to look at other more complex cases, take, say, the Israel-Palestine problem. I think there's a solution, namely the one that the large majority of the American population support, which happens to be the international consensus on a two-state settlement that the U.S. government rejects. Okay, so there's a solution for you. Let's just follow the will of the American population and go through the list. For example, on say, environmental issues, there's plenty of solutions. It's claimed that what you say is correct. That's what's claimed by the intellectual world, that no solutions are offered by the critics. That's just nonsense. It's just they don't like the solutions.
Since you first started in political activism in the 60s, do you feel that you have made a great deal of headway?
I think the country has made a great deal of headway, and I'm happy to participate in it, but it's not traceable to individuals. I mean, these are mass popular movements, and big changes in culture. It's across the board. If you go back to the 60s, for example, there was no feminist movement, there was no environmental movement, there were no third world solidarity movements, there was no substantial anti-nuclear movement, no global justice movements. I mean, these are all developments of the last 20 or 30 years, and they come from all over the place. For example, the solidarity movements, which are quite unique. There's never been a time when people from the aggressor country went to the victims and lived with them to try to protect them. That happened in the 80s. Tens of thousands of Americans did it, and they came from conservative circles. A lot of it was church-based. And it came from Main Street in the United States. And now it's all over the world. So you have people, say, in the Israeli-occupied territories, in Colombia and all over, trying to help the victims.
And yet you say there's this groundswell of support on Main Street, and yet you have a right-wing government there in Washington at the moment, and you have a great discrepancy between the way that the rest of the world increasingly views the United States and the way that the people of the United States view themselves.
That's not true. Take, say, the international economic arrangements, what are called the free trade agreements, so they don't have a lot to do with free trade. There's overwhelming public opposition to them. That's why these issues never arise in elections. If you take a look at the exclude a certain category of issues, namely those on which the public is opposed to the elites, those just don't arise. And that's part of the technique of marginalizing the public. And as you mentioned before, it's not that people are unaware of it, they know it. So before the year 2000 election, about 75% of the population regarded it as a complete farce.
But in which case, I mean, what happens to transfer that kind of feeling into any kind of action? Because at the moment you have people who actually, although they may be in favour of the idea of more self-government, having more control over their destinies, they're pushed to the limits just trying to, keep their families together, keep their jobs down. There isn't going to be that kind of support.
That's part of the technique of control.
Well, isn't that going to be broken then, is it?
Well, why isn't it going to be broken? I mean, slavery was broken. You look over history, one after another form of coercion and control has been broken. As the Soviet system was collapsed from inside, every system of tyranny we know about and oppression has been, people chip away at it and it ultimately collapses. There's nothing special about them. I mean, the systems of power that exist now are quite fragile, and they know it. So the World Economic Forum, for example, is well aware. That's what the Financial Times called the masters of the universe. They're well aware of how fragile their control is and concerned about it, and rightly.
What I wonder, though, is how you square your fundamental optimism about human nature with what seems to be a pretty pessimistic analysis of what's happening in the world.
It's a famous phrase that was borrowed by Gramsci, and that we should have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. It's sensible.
Professor Chomsky, thank you very much.
In recent months, more than 1 million people, most of them young, have protested against a new economic order called globalisation. This represents one of the greatest popular movements since the 1960s. Surely never before has the human race enjoyed such amazing capacity to create wealth and reduce poverty. Yet never before has the gulf between rich and poor been so vast and inequality so widespread. The facts of globalization are revealing. A small group of powerful individuals are now richer than most of the population of Africa. Just 200 giant corporations dominate a quarter of the world's economic activity. General Motors is now bigger than Denmark. Is this the global village we are told is our future? Or is it merely an old project that used to be run by the divine right of kings and is now run by the divine right of multinational corporations and by the financial institutions and governments that back them?
Globalisation is used by its champions to suggest a coming together of people of all races, of all countries, and it will relieve poverty, it will distribute wealth. What we're actually seeing is precisely the opposite processes in train, that the poor are becoming markedly poorer, while the very wealthy are becoming staggeringly wealthy.
Debt has really been used as an instrument in order for the IMF and the World Bank to get their policies implemented in many developing countries. And we're into a situation now where the poorest countries are in a cycle, a vicious cycle of poverty. They can't get out. And the kind of debt cancellation that's been given still will not allow them to get out of this poverty trap. It's not a question of debt forgiveness, because actually many of the debts were incurred under pressure from the international institutions or were given in collusion with governments which weren't acting in the interests of their people.
Let me ask you, do you know the difference between Tanzania and Goldman Sachs? Tanzania is a country that has a gross national product of $2.2 billion and shares it between 25 million people. Goldman Sachs is an investment firm which has annual profits of $2.2 billion and shares them among 161 partners. That's the world we're living in now.
These unfinished buildings are monuments to corruption on a scale unheard of in modern Asia, to what the World Bank called the miracle economy.
The bank presents itself as an economic development agency focused on the reduction of poverty. But in fact, the bank operated during the entire Cold War as an institution that distributed resources to mostly authoritarian regimes in the Third World that supported the West in the Cold War. So you had the irony of the West claiming that what they were defending in the Cold War was democracy and a certain vision of freedom, but doing so by upholding dictatorships like Indonesia around the world. What they did was they had plenty of projects, some of which surely were valuable, many of which were not.
I went to Washington to interview the chief economist of the World Bank, Nicholas Stern. I asked him to explain how almost 30% of World Bank loans to Indonesia had been lost or stolen.
We simply don't know what that number is.
Here's your own internal report, August 97. I quote, "We estimate that at least 20 to 30% of Government of Indonesia development budget funds are diverted through informal payments to government staff and politicians."
That number was plucked out of the air. Lots of times we have to guess with numbers, and the person who wrote that was guessing. Somebody comes up with a number and it gets recycled. But
a lot of money.
I don't want to dismiss the issue. Just let's not get hung up on one figure, which isn't a particularly hard
no,
figure.
but I mean, if it's a third of what the World Bank has put into one country,
no, then it's a serious question. When you have a loan, there's a lender and a borrower, and they share the responsibility in some way.
There's a strong case that has been made by people who've seen this evidence that the World Bank was duped by the Suharto regime, claiming that poverty had dropped to 30 million, and in fact poverty was around about 60 million.
Let's talk about the harder figures. The income poverty figures are always the most difficult ones to get your hands on. But I think the illiteracy figures in the infant mortality figures are in this case probably more reliable. And there was some progress during that 30-year period, significant progress, I mean cutting literacy by half and so on. That's a very important step forward, so let's not lose sight of that.
In 1997, the World Bank described the economy under Suharto in a famous report as absolutely dynamic, doing everything right, terrific, brilliant. You know, by that time, the whole Asian thing had already started to collapse. It wasn't until the following year that the World Bank, for the first time in 30 years, had anything to say
about a regime that is guilty of mass murder. Why was there such a silence that seemed to a lot of people simply to be complicity with this murderous dictatorship?
I think if we look back on our analysis of the economy and the politics at the time, we got a number of things wrong, and we have to understand that. We're going to get things wrong again. Not so many people called the Asian crisis before it happened. We failed along with
That's your job, though, isn't it? You're all economists with fantastic degrees and brilliant backgrounds, and how can you get it that wrong?
We're going to get it wrong some of the time. I think non-economists get it wrong a lot more often than economists. But this isn't a precise game, and there are going to be a number of occasions in the future where we get things wrong too.
So globalization creates debts, and debts creates misery, creates unemployment, creates the crisis, creates privatization, a lot of state enterprise being privatized. So people will have to pay more to have an access for instance, like health, education. So it's not natural. Debts is not natural. It's designed.
What do you say to those 17 million people who called for a complete, and I repeat, complete cancellation of debt as the only way to lift the huge number of poor people in the world out of poverty?
I'd say two things. First, what will lift people out of poverty is not cancelling their debt, but what policies their countries pursue, whether they educate poor people, whether they give them health. And so the question, and then what sort of economies they try to run. Do they integrate them into the world economy, or do they run corrupt economies? Those are the primary determinants of how well countries will do. That is the answer to what determines whether people get out of poverty. It can be done. It has been done. Should we cancel the debt? Cancelling debt is one way of giving resources to poor countries. What I'd like to see is a much greater flow of resources to poor countries. I'd like to see the markets of the industrialized countries opened so that these countries where people are poor and can produce agriculture are able to export. That's what will get them out of poverty. The statement debt relief is the only thing that will get them out of poverty is wrong. It would help, provided it is accompanied by a whole set of other measures.
But surely debt, even in one's own life, and especially a poor person's life, is the greatest cause of real poverty.
No.
And when you have a country devoting half its budget to paying off a debt, when you have the poorest countries in the world sending out millions of dollars into the rich world, surely as a priority, that debt has to be either relieved substantially or go altogether. Doesn't that make it just seems common sense to me? If I got that wrong?
Yeah, you've got it wrong.
Oh,
let me explain.
Okay.
First of all, you are indebted, and I am indebted. And I would not be better off if I asked somebody to come and cancel my debt, because I'd never be able to borrow again. And debt is a normal way of borrowing in order to do things, purchase goods, invest, when you don't have the resources, and they'll generate an income and you'll repay. So the notion that all debt should be cancelled is a bad one. Financial systems operate on the basis of debt that is paid.
The Human Rights Commission of the United Nations, in a very comprehensive report, said, and I quote, "The institutions of globalization have yet to seriously address the issue of human rights in a democratic fashion. Globalization has caused global conditions of inequality and discrimination." What's your response to that?
I simply can't respond because I have no idea what evidence they're referring to. Globalization has caused discrimination? I'd have thought it was the opposite. I'd have thought that...
No, for instance, they singled out workers in third world economic processing zones. Again, part of a prescription, may not be IMF prescription, but certainly part of a global prescription in which it said these workers were prey for exploitation, and because unemployment, for instance, they mentioned Indonesia, had been forced down by the so-called economic crisis of the late 90s, their human rights were lost.
You know, Indonesia grew as a result of integrating into the global economy from the 60s on, and incomes in Indonesia rose. It was a dictatorship. Some of their rights were suppressed, and it was a very bad dictatorship.
Excuse me, Mr. Fisher, as you say, some of their rights were oppressed. A third of the population of East Timor died or were killed under the Suharto regime.
What are you asking me that question for? Do you think we supported the Suharto regime?
Well,
Don't be ridiculous.
Well, did you speak out against it? Did your institution, the IMF, speak out? The World Bank didn't. The first time after 30-odd years in there, the first time they spoke out was 1998. What did the IMF say about it?
When the IMF went into Indonesia, it insisted on a removal of a host of corrupt practices that began to weaken that regime. It was not an intended consequence, but it was intended that we went in and helped remove the corrupt practices in a variety of monopoly areas.
The coverage of these events follows a pattern. It seems it's only news when there's violence, even when the great majority of the protesters are peaceful. In contrast, the violence of the economic policies they are protesting about is seldom news. In the weeks and days leading up to May Day in London, the police and the government orchestrated a propaganda campaign. The aim clearly was to alienate the public from the demonstrators by representing them collectively as violent and by suppressing the very issues that have public support.
The limits of tolerance are passed when protesters, in the name of some spurious cause, seek to inflict fear, terror, violence and criminal damage on our people and property.
To Tony Blair, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is a spurious cause. When May Day came, 6,000 police turned part of London's West End into a giant detention camp.
I think the issue of violence, which we're constantly asked about, is our main way in. I think that the key to these things is actually getting mass amounts of people involved, because the media will put one point of view across time and time again, you know, the mindless hooligan side. But when you think about the mass redundancies, the poverty, the starvation, the literal raping of a country through third world debt and what have you, that is violence on a huge scale. It's genocide.
The newest ruler of the world is the World Trade Organization based in Geneva. The Economist magazine calls it an embryo world government, and yet no one has voted for it. The effect of its policies make it illegal for governments to hinder the profits of big business. This is known as free trade.
If there's one feature about the global economy, it's the companies have globalized. But we haven't regulated the global companies. And that's the change that we've got to put into this international system if we're ever going to get rules that are fairer to workers, fairer to the world's poor, fairer to all of those who are affected by this international production system.
People can't stand by, they can't be spectators when we're faced with forces like this. They join this movement and the movement starts to gather momentum. Already we've had some extraordinary successes. We managed to stop the implementation of a crazy idea called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, which would have allowed corporations to sue governments for the removal of any law which they didn't like. Now that was being promoted, that idea, by the 29 most powerful countries on earth. It was being promoted by all the major multinational corporations and all the big institutions such as the World Trade Organization. And a ragged band of dissenters around the world managed to stop it. We beat them. And if we can beat that, we can beat anything.
In rich countries like Britain, globalisation is well advanced. The disastrous selling off of the railways and the creeping privatisation of everything from healthcare to air traffic control. The financial pages celebrate a booming economy, yet 1 in 5 British children grows up in poverty. There are almost 10 million Britons living in poverty. The gap between the rich and the rest gets wider, and this is said to be a spurious cause. Why not abolish the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization and replace them with genuine trade and development institutions that are democratically accountable? And why not cancel a debt that condemns nations like Indonesia to poverty and disease? These are dangerous times. The one superpower left in the world has made its ambitions clear. This is a document of the United States Space Command. It says, the globalization of the world economy will continue with a widening between haves and have-nots. It says only military dominance will protect America's commercial interests. Why should we accept this? Why should our children have to face these divisions and dangers? None of them is God-given. All of them can be changed.
The other thing that really bothers me about both the World Bank and the IMF and their bastard cousin, the WTO, is that they're all pushing as hard as they can globalization. And I think that this has become the new mantra for development. How do we globalize? Everything is so you have this huge interdependence. No, not interdependence, integration. So that's globalization, in my view, is not interdependence in the sense that you have relatively independent countries trading with each other. I mean, that's Bretton Woods. That's fine. That's good. Instead, they've gone to global integration. We all become one big global economy, not many different economies loosely connected to each other, but one big, tightly connected global economy through what? Free trade, and most importantly, free capital mobility, the free flow of capital. Well, I think that stymies national policies. Countries become very crippled in their ability to enact independent policies because everything they do is going to be limited by their relation to this big global economy, which says, no, you can't do that. And the WTO is in there, enforcing the rules. So I think the IMF and the World Bank have, in a sense, really breached their Bretton Woods Charter, because the Bretton Woods Charter was not for global economic integration, making one big world economy. It was for interdependence, for internationalization, for making it easier for independent countries to have good trading relations with each other. But now that's way in the background. The first director of the WTO made to me the infamous statement that we're writing the charter for a globally integrated economy, not for a trading set of nations. So that's a direct confrontation with the idea of the Bretton Woods institutions. So, in a way, I think they've abandoned their own historical charter by going whole hog into this globalization. And of course, who benefits from the globalization? Your big transnational corporations who don't want national governments controlling them.
In accordance with the principles of doublethink, it does not matter if the war is not real, or when it is that victory is not possible. The war is not meant to be won, it is meant to be continuous. The essential act of modern warfare is the destruction of the produce of human labor. A hierarchical society is only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance. In principle, the war effort is always planned to keep society on the brink of starvation. The war is waged by the ruling group against its own subjects, and its object is not victory over Eurasia or Eastasia, but to keep the very structure of society intact.
I've been around on this planet for a few decades now, and I've been fortunate to have lived most of my working life in different countries and cultures, which has been an incredible learning experience. But each time I returned to the UK, I was struck by how society had changed, how it seemed to have become blind to what was happening around it. Every couple of years I could see that there had been more of a shift towards selfishness and materialism, with people becoming almost obsessed with trying to achieve false aspirations. To achieve those false aspirations, people were plunging themselves into debt, seemingly without much considerations for the consequences. At the same time, society appeared to become a far less caring place. It was as though anyone who didn't buy into the propaganda was considered unworthy of attention or consideration. The disabled, the ill, the unfortunate, and anyone who had fallen on hard times. People didn't seem to care that they were being led along by propaganda, or they just chose to ignore their lives and comply with what was obviously to become their economic slavery. Each time I returned, there seemed to be a massive shift forward on the path to false achievement, less care, and what appeared to be the mass dumbing down of society. I think I noticed it more because I wasn't exposed to it all of the time. Perhaps the manipulation of society was happening at a rate that would hardly be noticed by anyone who was exposed to it day to day. Even so, I still couldn't understand why seemingly intelligent people hadn't noticed, or seemed to be ignoring, what was happening to them in the society they were supposed to be part of. In essence, it was as though evolution had come to a shuddering halt and started slipping backwards. People were encouraged to be selfish and ego-driven. People within society have gradually submitted to the illusion that they have no power to change things, that taking action would have dire consequences on their comfortable lives. Again, the result of the constant propaganda they were subjected to. And the slow, gradual manipulation of the population, particularly in Western cultures, has continued. It's no wonder that younger people in our society have become disillusioned with the world as it is right now. They've been led to believe that if they comply with the system, that there will be rewards. So they go into education with hope, go to university, only to find that most of their degrees are worthless in any practical sense, and others try to get meaningful work of some kind, only to find that the opportunities they've been promised don't exist. They've been lied to. Everything they were told as they went through the system has become nothing. They've lost understanding about what it is to be a member of humanity, because the focus has been so much on achieving, they've never been taught otherwise, unless they were lucky enough to be around people who didn't buy into the bullshit the rest of society embraced, or at least people that recognised the manipulation society had been subjected to. So it's no wonder that we have young people who are disillusioned, seeking solace in technology or dysfunctional behaviour, or become depressed or experience other mental health problems from stress. Then there are older members of our society. Most have worked and contributed to the system all of their lives, only to be abandoned when they're no longer productive economic slaves, with many abandoned to living their lives alone. While they struggle to eat and keep warm, they see the society they served abandoning, and the government they served wasting obscene amounts of money on trivial things. The same can be said for those who have worked most of their lives and fallen on hard times, either through illness or redundancy, which is usually the result of government policies, who are forced to sell off everything of value they have worked for and become the centre of abuse by that same government. We also see many ex-military personnel cast aside once they are no longer useful, forced to rely on charity. We could go on with many examples of how the government and other manipulators have no interest in basic humanitarian principles and only exist to serve the interests of themselves and their cronies. But there's some good news. There are more people who are beginning to realise what is wrong with the world and are taking steps to do something about it, rather than burying their heads in their own backsides and hoping it will all go away. As those in power become desperate to retain control and manipulate us to be their unquestioned servants, people are beginning to realise that life is more about interacting with each other rather than focusing on materialism. There's still a very, very long way to go, but the shift has started, and those in power are very worried.